The year is 1945. Germany, once the steel fist of Europe, was nothing but a collapsing empire, its cities reduced to dust, its skies silenced. 6 brutal years of war had ripped the continent apart, leaving a landscape of corpses, refugees, and shattered dreams. But amidst this apocalyptic chaos, deep in the heart of Bavaria, something truly astonishing lay hidden. At an airfield called Lechfeld, American troops, not just any troops, but a specialized vanguard tasked with snatching enemy secrets, stumbled upon a sight that defied belief. Inside war-torn hangars, nestled among bomb craters and abandoned wrecks, were sleek, menacing aircraft, unlike anything they had ever witnessed. No propellers, no familiar roar. These machines breathed fire their swept wings, hinting at unbelievable speed. The Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, a weapon from a terrifying future. For the Americans, it was a vault of unimaginable power waiting to be unlocked. Yet the true shock wasn't just the jets. Standing calmly among these marvels was a man in worn Luftwaffe attire, his face etched with the weariness of a war lost. Karl Bauer. Not a defiant general nor a fleeing ace, but Messerschmitt's chief test pilot. The one man who had tamed these fire-breathing beasts, who knew their every dangerous secret. He hadn't escaped. He hadn't destroyed the jets. He had waited. The Americans' rifles trained couldn't comprehend it. Why? The answer, both practical and electrifying, was about to hit them like a gut punch. They didn't just want to look at these jets, they wanted to fly them. And for that they needed Bauer. Suspicion, sharp and icy, immediately cut through the air. This was an enemy officer standing on conquered ground. Every fiber of military protocol screamed for his immediate imprisonment. But as the GIs stared from Bauer to the dozens of Me-262 surrounding them, machines capable of rewriting the rules of aerial combat, a stark, dangerous realization dawned. This wasn't a time for rules. This was a moment for desperate innovation. And so, in a twist that defied logic and years of bloody conflict, instead of a prison cell, Karl Bauer was led to the flight line. The unspoken question hung heavy. Could the bitterest enemies truly cooperate, not on a battlefield, but in the very cockpit of war? At first, suspicion hung in the air. Here was a Luftwaffe officer, technically the enemy, standing on a captured field. The normal procedure would have been to march him off at gunpoint and lock him behind barbed wire. But the situation was far from normal. In front of the Americans were dozens of Me-262 machines that could change everything about air warfare if they learned how to operate them. And so instead of a prison cage, Bauer was brought to the flight line. Imagine the strangeness of that moment. Just days earlier, men in American cockpits and men in German cockpits had been trying to kill each other in the skies above Europe. Now those same Americans were asking a German to step into their aircraft and teach them how not to kill themselves by mishandling an engine. The lines between friend and foe blurred under the roar of jet turbines. Bauer began explaining in broken English, sometimes gesturing, sometimes pointing at gauges and levers. The Americans listened carefully. Everything about the Me-262 was unfamiliar metric instruments. German labels, a startup sequence so sensitive that if you rushed it, the engine could flame out or even explode. It was nothing like the piston aircraft they knew. This was raw, dangerous technology, and the margin for error was razor thin. One pilot later recalled the nerves of sitting in the cockpit for the first time. The gauges stared back in a language he didn't read, the throttle felt delicate, and the nose of the jet seemed to stretch forever. Bauer leaned over, tapped a dial, and said simply, "Slow, always slow, or it breaks." That advice, delivered by a man who should have been an enemy, may have saved American lives. In those next days, the strangeness didn't end there. On some of the captured jets, the Americans hurriedly painted over swastikas with white stars, as if trying to erase the past with a brushstroke. In one surreal scene, a German pilot strapped himself into the rear seat of a 2-seat Me-262B, while an American sat in the front. The engine screamed, the jet rolled forward, and for the first time the United States military took flight in the very weapon designed to destroy them. What happened on that Bavarian runway wasn't just a technical transfer. It was a moment of human contradiction. cooperation, born from desperation, respect, forged out of necessity, and a quiet understanding that survival sometimes outweighed loyalty. But the real tension was only beginning, because flying the Me-262 wasn't just dangerous, it was nearly suicidal for anyone who didn't know its secrets. The approach to Lechfeld airfield was nothing like the bloody battles that had marked the Allied push through Europe. By May 1945, the German army was collapsing everywhere. Units surrendered by the thousands, soldiers abandoned their posts, and civilians waited nervously on the roads with white sheets in their hands. Still, nobody could be sure what lay ahead at a military airfield deep in Bavaria. When the Americans rolled in weapons ready, they expected resistance. Instead, they found silence broken only by the crackle of fires still smoldering in the distance. The runway stretched out before them, scarred with bomb craters. The hangars looked battered from previous raids. But inside was another story. The first troops to step through the wide steel doors were stunned. Parked row after row, some damaged, some intact, were sleek silver-gray jets with shark-like noses and swept-wings planes, unlike anything most of these men had ever seen. A few whispered the same thought. These look like something from the future. The Me-262 was a sight both mesmerizing and unnerving for the Americans. It felt as though they had stumbled into a laboratory where tomorrow's war was already waiting. And then, amid the wreckage and the jets, they saw men in Luftwaffe uniforms. Not squads of armed defenders, but a small group: engineers, mechanics, and one pilot who carried himself with quiet confidence. His name was Karl Bauer. He didn't raise his hands in panic or run for cover. Instead, he stepped forward and spoke in halting English. "I am test pilot. I stay." The Americans didn't know what to make of it. Was this a trap? A trick? Bauer looked more tired than threatening, more like a man who understood the war was finished. The soldiers surrounded him, rifles trained, waiting for orders. Normally, a Luftwaffe officer of his rank would be taken straight into custody. Yet as the GIs looked around at the gleaming jets filling the hangars, something shifted. This man wasn't just another prisoner. He was the key to unlocking the machines around them. While a few soldiers kept their weapons fixed, others began inspecting the cockpits. Confusion set in almost immediately. The controls were labeled in German, the gauges ran on metric, and the throttle mechanisms looked unfamiliar. These weren't just captured trophies. They were highly dangerous aircraft that could either reveal priceless secrets or kill anyone careless enough to start them. That's when Bauer's role became clear. He was the one man who knew every bolt, every gauge, every twitch of these jets. For years, he had risked his life as Messerschmitt's chief test pilot, flying prototypes when engines failed mid-air, when wings vibrated, when landing gear refused to lock. He had survived mechanical failures that would terrify even veteran fighter aces. And now, on this broken airfield, those experiences became a lifeline for the Americans. An officer pulled him aside. "You know these planes?" Bauer nodded. "You can show us how they work." Another pause, then a calm reply. "Yes, but careful, very careful." The Americans didn't trust him fully. How could they? Just days earlier, men in uniforms like his had torn through Allied bombers with the same aircraft now parked in these hangars. But they also knew they had little choice. The Me-262 was years ahead of anything the Allies had. Every hour that passed was a race against time, not only to understand the jet, but to make sure the Soviets advancing from the east didn't get their hands on them first. So instead of sending Bauer away under guard, they kept him close. His engineers, too frightened but cooperative, were ordered to stay with the machines and explain everything. Soldiers watched them closely, rifles never lowered. But for now, they were no longer prisoners. They were unwilling instructors. The Americans moved quickly. They assigned men from a small technical intelligence team that would later earn the nickname Watson's Wizards. These weren't typical frontline soldiers. They were pilots, mechanics, and engineers themselves. Men chosen to capture and fly whatever cutting-edge technology the Germans left behind. At Lechfeld, they had struck the jackpot. One of the first things they noticed was the sheer fragility of the jets. Many had flat tires. or broken canopies. Engines sat half-assembled, and some fuselages bore scars from bomb fragments. Yet, even in this battered state, the Me-262 seconds radiated an aura of speed and danger. One American pilot later said that just standing beside the plane gave him the sense it was meant to kill. Bauer walked slowly along the line of captured aircraft, explaining in his clipped English what each part meant. He pointed to the Jumo 004 engines, warning that they could flame out if throttled too quickly. He tapped a gauge and told them which numbers meant life and which meant fiery disaster. For the Americans, it was surreal. Here was the enemy pilot calmly teaching them the secrets of the jet that had terrified bomber crews across Europe. As the day wore on, the tension between captor and captive began to blur. The GIs joked uneasily, some even posing for photos in the cockpits. But underneath it all was a growing awareness. They were standing at the edge of something entirely new, and every word from Bauer's mouth carried weight. But words were one thing. Strapping into the cockpit and trusting a German prisoner to guide you through a live flight was something else entirely. And that test was coming faster than anyone expected. Karl Bauer had lived through the entire arc of Germany's air war. He wasn't a glamorous ace with victory tallies painted under his cockpit. He was something different. Someone who worked in the shadows of Messerschmitt's factories and airfields, flying the machines nobody else dared to touch. Every time an experimental engine coughed and died mid-air, or a wing shuddered on the edge of breaking, it was Bauer who had to bring the prototype back down in one piece. His courage didn't come from chasing kills. It came from stepping into the unknown day after day. Now, in May 1945, he found himself standing in front of American officers, explaining that he was the man who knew the Me-262 better than anyone alive. To them, he wasn't just a captured German, he was a key. Whether he liked it or not, the Americans wanted to know who he really was. One officer questioned him directly. Name Karl Bauer. Rank test pilot. Messerschmitt. You flew these jets. Bauer pointed to the nearest. Me-262. All of them. First flights. Many times. It was hard for the Americans to believe. They were used to frontline pilots, men who bragged about combat kills. Bauer spoke differently. He described the jets like living creatures, temperamental, dangerous, always threatening to bite back. He explained how the Jumo 004 engines needed gentle handling, how sudden throttle changes could rip them apart. He talked about fuel shortages, mechanical failures, and the countless hours spent coaxing unstable prototypes into the air. For the GIs listening, it was the first time they heard a Luftwaffe officer speak without arrogance. There was no triumph in his voice, no pride, only the tone of a man who had survived long enough to know that the machine could be as much an enemy as any Allied fighter. Privately, Bauer felt the weight of his situation. He knew what usually happened to captured German officers. Many ended up behind fences for months, some for years. Others vanished into Soviet camps. Yet here he was, standing in the open, his life measured by the value of the knowledge in his head. It was strange, but it kept him alive. As night fell on the airfield, the Americans set up camp. Guards were posted, and the jets stood in eerie silence under the Bavarian sky. Bauer and a handful of his engineers were kept close, watched carefully but treated differently than regular prisoners. Instead of rations tossed at them through a wire fence, they ate near the Americans. Conversation was minimal, but sometimes one of the younger soldiers would ask almost curiously, "So, did you ever shoot down any of ours?" "No," Bauer would answer. Simply, "I test. I fly, so others can fight." That honesty caught some by surprise. It stripped away the myth that every man in a Luftwaffe uniform had blood on his hands. Some were there because war gave them no choice. Bauer had never been a Nazi loyalist, at least not in the way propaganda posters showed. He was an engineer's pilot, someone who believed in flight itself more than in the politics behind it. Still, trust didn't come easy. American mechanics examined every detail of the jet's half-suspecting sabotage. They asked Bauer to repeat instructions, cross-checked his answers, even forced him to sit in a cockpit and demonstrate. When he showed how the throttles had to be advanced slowly to avoid destroying the engines, they watched his hands carefully. If he made one wrong move, he knew it could cost him dearly. There were moments of tension. At one point, an American pilot leaned close and said quietly, "You know, if you're lying to us, if one of our boys goes down because of this, there won't be a second chance." Bauer looked him in the eye and replied, "I want to live too. I tell you true." That answer was enough for now. But Bauer's role wasn't just technical. It was symbolic. On that airfield, Americans and Germans were forced to stand shoulder to shoulder, not as enemies, but as men staring at the future of aviation. For a brief moment, the war lines blurred. A prisoner's knowledge was trusted more than a soldier's rifle. But words and promises would soon meet their ultimate test, because the Americans weren't content to listen, they wanted to fly. And for that they would need Bauer in the cockpit beside them. The Americans had listened, taken notes, and peered into cockpits with growing curiosity. But notes on paper meant nothing if no one could get the jet off the ground. They needed more than theory. They needed proof that these alien-looking aircraft could be flown safely by their own men. That meant one thing: Karl Bauer would climb back into the Me-262 this time with his captors. The chosen machine was rare, a two-seat Me-262B, usually built as a night fighter. Its stretched cockpit had space for both Bauer and an American pilot. Soldiers gathered as the two men strapped in the silence, heavy with tension. Onlookers knew that the moment those engines roared to life, history was about to change. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was taut. The American pilot, a young captain from the technical unit, glanced at the unfamiliar gauges. "I don't read German," he muttered, frustrated. Bauer leaned over, calm but firm. "Watch this one," he said, pointing to a dial. "Temperature too hot, engine gone." The American frowned. "How slow do I bring the throttle up?" Bauer's reply was short. "Very slow. No hurry. Treat it like glass." The Jumo 4 seconds whined to life, spitting smoke, before settling into a steady growl. The men on the ground instinctively stepped back. No one there had heard a jet engine this close before. It sounded alien raw, as though the air itself was being torn apart. The plane rolled down the cracked runway, its nose long and heavy. For the American, everything felt wrong. The throttle response lagged, the instruments were strange, and the jet's acceleration was unlike any piston fighter he'd flown. As the airspeed built, Bauer gestured. Now the Me-262 lifted cleanly into the Bavarian sky. The pilot marveled at the speed. The horizon seemed to rush toward them faster than he could process. Bauer, in the rear seat, stayed calm. "Careful. Always think ahead. Jet does not wait for you." The test was short, just a circuit around the field, but every second burned itself into memory. When the pilot pulled the throttle back to descend, the jet didn't slow as expected. Panic flickered in his voice. "She's not coming down." Bauer snapped back quickly. "Patience. Let her glide. Jet keeps going." It was a lesson that would save lives. A propeller plane bled speed when throttled down. The Me-262 didn't. To handle it, a pilot had to think miles ahead. Landing was the true danger. Too fast and you'd overshoot the runway. Too slow and the fragile engines could flame out. The jet lined up for landing. Sweat dripped from the American's forehead as he tried to balance speed, descent, and nerves. "Hold her steady," Bauer instructed. "Don't fight." The wheels screeched against the runway, bounced once, then settled. The aircraft slid to a stop, engines whirring down. They had survived. On the ground, the soldiers erupted, not with cheers, but with disbelief. A German jet captured days ago had just flown with an American in control. The impossible had become reality. That flight opened the door. One by one, other American pilots climbed into cockpits. Some had Bauer or one of his engineers in the rear seat. Others learned by watching and trying. Every flight carried risk. The engines were unreliable, prone to sudden failure. Landing gear sometimes refused to deploy. Yet each success added to a growing confidence that these machines could be mastered. It was a bizarre sight, swastikas hastily painted over with white stars, jets roaring into the sky with American hands on the controls and German prisoners guiding them. One soldier joked darkly, "Only weeks ago those things were shooting at us. Now we're babysitting them." But beneath the humor was awe. They were flying the future, and the enemy was teaching them how. For Bauer, the emotions were complex. Relief that his knowledge was keeping him alive. Pride that the aircraft he had risked his life testing could impress even his captors. And a quiet resignation that the war he had given years to was finished. The Me-262 no longer belonged to the Reich. It now belonged to whoever had the strength to keep it in the air. But flying over Bavaria was only the beginning. The Americans weren't content with test hops. They wanted these jets ferried across Europe, a task that would push both the planes and the men to their limits. By the time the first few flights proved successful, the Americans knew they had stumbled onto a treasure that couldn't be left behind. But capturing the jets was only half the battle. Getting them out of war-torn Germany and into Allied hands for study was another story. That task fell to a group that quickly earned a nickname whispered with a mix of respect and disbelief: Watson's Wizards. The group was officially part of the Air Technical Intelligence Unit, commanded by Colonel Harold E. Watson. Their mission was simple to write on paper, but nearly impossible to carry out. Locate advanced German aircraft, make them flyable, and ferry them to Allied airfields before the Soviets or looters got to them first. At Lechfeld, they had hit the jackpot with the Me-262. But now came the question, could they actually move these fragile jets across Europe? The Wizards weren't typical combat men. They were pilots, mechanics, engineers, all with technical expertise. Many were still young, but every one of them had the nerve to strap into an unfamiliar cockpit and trust his instincts. As one of them later said, it wasn't courage, it was curiosity, mixed with orders. To make the jets ready, Bauer and his engineers worked alongside American mechanics. At first, it was tense. The GIs kept their rifles nearby, suspicious of sabotage. But over time, necessity bred a strange sort of teamwork. An American sergeant barked orders at his men, while a German mechanic pointed silently at a wiring harness that needed fixing. A pilot scribbled notes while Bauer explained with gestures how the throttle couldn't be pushed forward like a Mustang's. The language barrier was thick, but the roar of engines was universal. When a jet fired up and stayed running without belching smoke, both sides felt the same rush of accomplishment. For a moment, captor and captive shared something larger than themselves, the thrill of making a dead machine breathe again. Still, the danger was real. One flight nearly ended in disaster when a young American pilot misjudged his descent and slammed the jet onto the runway so hard the landing gear threatened to collapse. As he staggered out of the cockpit, pale and shaken, Bauer muttered, "Too fast, always too fast." It wasn't mockery. It was the weary voice of a man who had seen too many near deaths already. There were other challenges. Spare parts were scarce. Some planes had been bomb damaged, others stripped by desperate German crews before surrender. Fuel was another nightmare. The Me-262 guzzled kerosene-like J2 fuel, which wasn't easy to come by in collapsing Germany. The Americans scavenged whatever they could, sometimes improvising with substitutes that pushed the engines even closer to failure. Despite everything, the Wizards managed to get several jets airworthy. One by one, they lifted off from Lechfeld, guided by the strange knowledge of their German instructors. The plan was to fly them to Cherbourg in France, where they could be loaded onto ships bound for the United States. Each flight was a gamble. If an engine failed mid-air, there was no guarantee of a safe landing. If weather turned bad, the primitive jets had little in the way of instruments to help. Every pilot who climbed into the cockpit knew he was playing with death, yet the flights went on. The Americans couldn't afford to waste time. The Soviets were sweeping into eastern Germany, and rumors spread that they too were seizing Me-262s for their own study. The Cold War wasn't official yet, but everyone felt it coming. The Wizards understood that whoever mastered this technology first would hold an advantage in the skies of tomorrow. Some of the men spoke later about how strange it felt to rely on the enemy for survival. One recalled standing on the tarmac with a German mechanic adjusting the engine cowling beside him. "I remember thinking this man might have worked yesterday to keep these jets in the air against us. Today he's making sure I can fly one home." War changes quick. That uneasy alliance produced results. Within weeks, a small fleet of Me-262s stood ready, painted with American markings. Soldiers shook their heads at the sight enemy jets, with stars and bars replacing swastikas sitting under the same Bavarian Sunday. It was surreal, but it was real. But the most dangerous part was yet to come, because now those fragile jets had to cross hundreds of miles of broken Europe, and one mistake could mean the loss of man and machine. Moving the Me 262 seconds from Bavaria to the French coast wasn't just an engineering challenge. It was a test of nerve. The jets were fragile, temperamental, and completely unforgiving to mistakes. To ferry them across a continent shattered by war meant gambling lives every time a wheel left the ground. But the Americans had no choice. If these planes weren't moved soon, they risked losing them to looters, weather, or worse, the advancing Soviets. The first flights out of Lechfeld were watched with a mixture of awe and dread. Onlookers saw the slender jets taxi down cracked runways, engines shrieking louder than anything they'd ever heard. One soldier said later, "It was like hearing thunder you couldn't escape. You felt it in your chest before you even saw the plane." Inside the cockpits, it was another world. American pilots sweated as they tried to translate Bauer's instructions into action. The gauges didn't match what they knew, and the controls responded with sluggishness at low speeds and frightening sensitivity at high ones. Even the takeoff roll felt wrong. The jet was heavier, the acceleration slower at first, but then like a sudden kick, the speed came on so fast it felt like the ground disappeared beneath them. The flights weren't long, just hops from one captured airfield to the next, slowly pushing west. But each leg was a trial. Crosswinds on bomb-damaged runways threatened to send the fragile landing gear collapsing. Engines overheated, and several had to be shut down mid-flight, forcing emergency landings. In one harrowing moment, a pilot lost power just after liftoff and barely managed to belly land the jet onto a field outside Stuttgart. When he climbed out, shaken but alive, his first words were, "She tried to kill me." Yet not every flight ended in disaster. Against the odds, most succeeded. Pilots grew more confident with each leg learning the rhythm of the jet. "Always think 10 miles ahead," one pilot said, echoing Bauer's warning. "If you wait until you need to react, you're already dead." The Germans who rode along in some of the transfers carried their own strange burden. For years, they had served a regime that demanded loyalty to death. Now they were strapped in beside Americans, their swastikas painted over their silence heavy. They weren't comrades, not exactly, but in the cockpit there was no room for ideology. There was only trust, thin, reluctant, but real. One American lieutenant later recalled a moment in the air with a German engineer behind him. "We didn't speak a word the whole flight. When we landed, he just tapped my shoulder once, like to say, 'Good job.' And I thought, isn't that the strangest thing? This man who might have prayed for my death last month is proud I made it back alive today." By June, enough jets had made the trek to Cherbourg that the docks became a surreal sight. Sleek German fighters lined up beside Allied cargo ships. Workers hauled them onto decks, tying them down under American flags. Locals in France gathered to stare, whispering about the strange machines with swept wings and shark-like noses. Children pointed unsure whether to fear them or marvel. The shipping itself carried risk. These were not sturdy machines built for long storage. Engines could corrode from salt air. Delicate parts could snap under strain. The Americans did what they could. Greased joints, sealed engines, crated spares. But even as they lashed down the last Me 262, they knew not every jet would survive the journey. The important thing was that some did enough to study, enough to learn. Behind the technical achievement was something deeper. The image of German pilots sitting in cockpits marked with American stars captured the contradictions of war enemies, one week reluctant partners the next. It showed how quickly lines blurred when survival, curiosity, and ambition took over. On those airstrips and in those cockpits, the men lived an unspoken truth. Sometimes the machine mattered more than the uniform. The jet didn't care who flew it, only that it was flown correctly. And for both Americans and Germans, that realization created a bond stronger than propaganda. And that realization created a bond stronger than propaganda. But while the jets were headed for a new life across the Atlantic, the men who flew them couldn't escape the weight of what it all meant, and that legacy would shape aviation and their memories for years to come. When the ships carrying the Me-262 seconds reached American shores, a profound mixture of relief and disbelief settled over the pilots and engineers who had ferried them. Relief that they had survived an ordeal few outside their circle even knew about, and disbelief that the war was over. Yet they had spent its final climactic days flying enemy aircraft under American markings. At Wright Field in Ohio, engineers, mechanics, and test pilots gathered around the jets as they were unloaded, their silver fuselages gleaming, even if battered like artifacts from a future not yet written. The U.S. Army Air Forces wasted no time pulling the jets apart, studying their engines, aerodynamics, and controls. American test pilots, many veterans of fierce combat, took the Me-262 seconds into the sky to see for themselves. Their reports confirmed what had been felt in Germany. The aircraft was years ahead of anything else in the air. Fast, sleek, deadly in the right hands, but also fragile, demanding, and plagued with flaws that came from being rushed into war before its time. Karl Bauer, for his part, was not shipped off to a prison camp. Instead, he was questioned, debriefed, and eventually found work again in aviation after the war. He lived in part because of the knowledge he carried and the way he shared it when it mattered most. His story became one of survival, not through resistance or escape, but through cooperation at the very moment the world expected hostility. For the Americans who flew with him, the memory of that cooperation stayed sharp. Years later, one of Watson's wizards admitted that when he first saw Bauer, he imagined the man had once cheered while Allied bombers burned. Yet in those dangerous flights, Bauer had risked his own life to keep his captors alive. It was an irony no one could ignore. A German pilot keeping American pilots safe in the cockpit of Hitler's most advanced weapon. The Me-262 itself never changed the outcome of World War II. By the time it entered combat, Germany's fuel supplies were shattered, pilots were undertrained, and Allied numbers were overwhelming. But the jet changed the future. Its lessons fed directly into post-war designs on both sides of the Atlantic. The United States studied its engines, its aerodynamics, and its flaws, applying them to the next generation of fighters. The Soviet Union did the same with the jets they captured. Within a few years, new aircraft, faster, more powerful, more reliable, were streaking across the skies, direct descendants of the strange machines captured at Lechfeld. But the story of Lechfeld isn't just about technology. It's about people caught in moments that defied the simplicity of us versus them. Soldiers who expected to cage prisoners found themselves listening to them instead. Engineers who thought their work would die with the Reich ended up saving the lives of their enemies. And pilots who had trained to destroy these aircraft suddenly found themselves flying them with Germans strapped into the back seat. There is a moral hidden in all of it. War divides, dehumanizes, and pushes men to see only uniforms and flags. Yet in the silence of a cockpit under the threat of a dangerous engine, none of that mattered. Trust, thin, temporary, but real, grew where hate should have lived. It didn't erase the crimes of the regime nor the suffering inflicted across Europe, but it showed that even in the ashes of war, cooperation could surface in the most unlikely of places. Looking back, it's easy to romanticize those moments, to picture smiles and handshakes on the runway. The reality was harsher. Suspicion lingered, the threat of death hung over every takeoff. But what mattered most was that men chose to fly together anyway. They proved that even in a world ripped apart, survival sometimes meant seeing the humanity in the person beside you, no matter the uniform. And maybe that's the lesson worth carrying. Beyond the story of jets and captured pilots, progress, whether in technology or in life, often comes when we stop clinging to old divisions and start asking what we can build even with those we once called enemies. So the next time you hear about the Me-262 or Watson's wizards or the strange cooperation at Lechfeld, remember this: the future isn't always decided by who wins or loses a battle. Sometimes it's shaped by the choice to share knowledge, to trust in the moment, and to look past the war long enough to fly the plane together. If this story made you think, if it gave you a glimpse of humanity in the chaos of war, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in history's hidden corners.